All right, so let's talk about the airway and the lungs. And then that's the end of the videos for, well, it's the end of my lectures for this week. All right, so we've kind of talked about this, but just to remind you that you've got a couple things going on in the respiratory system, right? So you've got what's called the pulmonary apparatus, which is your trachea and your lungs, and the thoracic cavity, just the cavity. So kind of think of it as like a negative space surrounding. In this, it's this black area surrounding the lungs. There's no tissue that is making up the outside of that. I mean, there is tissue that makes up the outside of it, but the pulmonary apparatus doesn't include that tissue. It's just the lungs, the trachea, and that thoracic cavity. It is not connected to the rib cage wall. That's important. There's a really important reason why it's not connected. So you can see, I mean, it is connected at the trachea. That's it. At the very top of the trachea. That's where the two come together and actually make contact. The rib cage wall and the trachea will, make contact, not necessarily be fused together, but they'll make contact. They'll make rigid contact with each other. But you've got this rib cage wall, and then you've got the lungs, which are inside of there. They're kind of free-floating in there. They're connected to the trachea, but otherwise free-floating. The reason why they can't be connected is because you want it to be pressure that's pulling these things. If you had connections between the two, well, actually, let me just advance to the next slide. So you have something called pleural lining, which actually lines the outside of the lungs. So you can't really see it here, but you'd have something that's called a pleural lining, like a very thin film of cells. It's cells that secrete mucus. Those are on the inside of the chest wall, and then also on the outside of the lungs. And essentially what this does is it creates a surface that has less friction and prevents abrasion between the lungs and the thoracic cavity. You want them to be able to move independently, right? Because as the lungs are growing, they're going to move, right? They're going to kind of flow on there. You don't want the chest cavity to pull the lungs out, because then they'll want to move down and things will stretch and possibly break, and that's not good. You want them to be independent. There is a disease called pleurisy, and that creates adhesions between the lungs and the chest cavity wall. And that makes it very painful to breathe, because every time you breathe, it's stretching these adhesions. It's pulling on the inside of the chest wall. It's pulling on the lungs, and the lung tissue is very delicate. And so then when you are recovering from pleurisy, you have to take deep breaths and kind of break up these adhesions so you can breathe normally. And it's a really painful process. You can see how delicate the lungs are. This is an electron microscope picture of the inside of the lung tissue, and it's really, there's not a lot going on there. There's no like skin. There's no thick skin layer to it. There's that thin pleural lining, and then there's just this really kind of tender tissue. Let's see if there's anything else I want to talk about here. The diaphragm that we know is going to separate the upper thoracic cavity from the abdominal content down here. So you've got chest wall, diaphragm, and then the abdomen here, and the abdominal wall. And that makes up the entire thing. The diaphragm moves. There's more or less area in the thoracic cavity. The pulmonary apparatus enlarges, fills with air, or shrinks and moves air out. And then the abdominal content either moves out, further out of the body, or back into the body. So these little holes are going to allow the lungs to kind of inflate with air during respiration. So they're kind of spongy. I mean, it looks spongy, and it is spongy. It's very much like a sponge. So they're going to fill with air. They're called alveoli. We'll talk about them in just a second. these larger things here, these are bronchioles, so larger airway tubes. This as well is a branching one. So the larger tubes don't have that alveoli structure because they're just conduction. They're just tubes for air to flow through. But then around it you do see these little delicate structures. Okay, this video I'm not going to show you in the lecture. It'll be on the Canvas slides, and it's just kind of showing, you know, how the lungs work. So it's a recommended video. Oh, yeah, this gets bigger. I forgot about that. I just think that the structure of the lungs is really pretty cool. You can see that in here there is something that's a little thicker, kind of like, you know, a protective skin. That's the bronchiole tube, but on the outside you don't have that, and so it's really delicate. And again, that's why you don't want there to be adhesions between the chest wall and the outside of the lungs. Okay, so your airway is going to start. I mean, it starts at your mouth, right, and it moves through your mouth, down your throat, and then here, this is the hyoid bone, which you can feel. It's the only bone. We'll talk more about the hyoid bone in a second. In fact, there you go. So we'll talk about this when we talk about the phonation. But if you feel on your throat right here, you can feel a very hard structure. That's the thyroid cartilage right here. This is the really thick structure. If you're a guy, this part pokes out a lot more. It's your Adam's apple. So if you feel right on that, if you're a girl, you have it. It's just, it's not as pronounced, right? So you can feel it. It's kind of hard to do when you're talking, but you can feel this notch. You can feel this notch with your finger. If you get that notch, and you go kind of in and up a little bit, you'll feel another hard structure. That's your hyoid bone. That kind of gives you an idea of where we're looking. A lot of the tongue muscles connect to the hyoid bone, so it's in this area. So this is where we're looking. Thyroid cartilage is here, and then you've got your trachea, which runs down and then into your lungs. So, sorry, pushing on that, kind of. So the air is going to flow down your trachea, and then once you get here, this is a non-continuous ring of cartilage. If you looked at the back of it, it would be open. It's kind of shaped like this. If you cut off my hands, it's kind of shaped like this. The cricoid cartilage right here, this is actually shaped like a ring. So it is a complete ring, right? It's complete. But the other cartilaginous lining of the trachea here is open. You can see here that it's kind of open. Think of like crappy jewelry that you get out of those like coin machines when you're a kid. It's open at the back, so it can like resize itself to your growing finger, or it doesn't know what age or size of kid it's coming out to because it's crap, you know. So it's made to be resized. That is true of this cartilage as well. It can resize to accommodate more or less air. So you have, it's not continuous cartilage either. It's little rings of cartilage. Think for a second why you want it to be not, well actually, think for a second if you think it would be better to have continuous cartilage for the trachea, no cartilage at all for the trachea, or this kind of structure where there's some trachea, some structure, and then some softer areas. Just think about it for 1 second. You can pause this if you want to. So actually what ends up happening is if this is completely rigid, if it's cartilage all the way down, if it's just a tube like a straw, think about what happens with a straw when you bend it a little bit. It breaks, right? And nobody likes a broken straw. Then you can't drink your Frappuccino. But the same thing would happen with your airway as well. It'd be much easier to break your airway if it was completely, hard, if you had the structure all the way. Now, if it was not structure at all, you wouldn't be able to break it if it was just like a floppy tube, more like the esophagus. You wouldn't be able to break it, but it could collapse, and then it would be hard to get air in or out, which wouldn't be good, right? So you don't want an airway to be able to collapse in on itself. You want the airway to remain open. That way, if you're unconscious or something like that, breathing can still happen easily and not have to force the airway back open. So this is a good structure because it keeps the airway from collapsing in on itself, but it's not completely rigid, so it can bend. It's kind of like a bendy straw, really, which is, the best of all the straws. You can bend it and it doesn't break, and it's fun. So the trachea is fun. It's a lot like a bendy straw. All right. So the trachea is going to be the main airway. Air flows down here to this. This is called the carina. I'm not going to ask you about that on the exam, but it's kind of interesting to know about. It's shaped like a boat keel, and carina means boat keel. This is where you have your bronchus branch off from the trachea, right? All right, so we've got here's the trachea and the carina, and then the two bronchial tubes. So if you're looking at this, this is kind of shaped like a person looking at you. So the left is over here, even though it's on your right side. And so what you see is that this right side, which is on your left, branches off at a 45-degree angle, and this side over here, the left side, even though it's on your right, has a different angle. It's either more or less depending on where you're measuring from, but it kind of comes down and shoots off a little bit more dramatically than this one does. And that's because it's accommodating the heart over here on the left side, even though it's on your right. So the heart has to fit into this structure. It's kind of, here, let me jump back. This is the heart right here. See, it's kind of nestled in with the lungs. So it'd be somewhere right here. So they kind of branch off at different angles. These tubes are going to branch into ever smaller bronchial tubes until they become alveoli. The alveoli are these little bubble-shaped structures, and this is where the actual gas exchange takes place. So the lungs are important for exchanging gas. They're important for oxygenating the blood. The air that's in the lungs is also very important for speech, but for a completely different reason. I mean, it is important that we have oxygenated blood for speech. If we weren't oxygenating our blood for speech, we'd be dead and we wouldn't be talking. So that's an important process. But the actual air that we're taking in, we're kind of hijacking the process of gas exchange to create a power source for phonation. So let me back up really quickly. Right around here is where your vocal cords are located. And so you're going to breathe in, and there's going to be gas exchange that happens in the alveoli when you're breathing in. When you're breathing out, we're hijacking that exhalation process right here and creating a power source for the vocal folds. Let me grab... Okay, and so then while the exhale happens, right, the vocal folds are pulled together and you kind of hijack that process. Anyway, so that's how it creates the power source for phonation. So we're hijacking the exhalation process. We're putting these vocal cords in the way of the exhalation process, and they're vibrating to create sound. And then more things happen that we'll talk about further in the course. But anyway, that's how the speech process is a little bit different just from the breathing process. Anyway, the breathing process, the gas exchange part, the part that you could argue, well, that definitely came before speech, right? Because a lot of animals that don't and can't talk breathe. So the air comes in, the air fills up, oxygenated air, I should specify, fills up these little alveoli. The alveoli, like I showed you in that picture, very delicate. I want to call it skin. It's not really skin. The epithelial layer of the alveoli is very thin. What's good about that is it allows the oxygen to be able to move through that epithelial layer. And so what you have is unoxygenated blood comes down. The capillaries get really small in this area. So you've got, if you imagine this as one alveolus, rather, the capillaries get so small that they can almost cover the entire alveolus in just tiny little strands of capillaries. They're so tiny. It's about the size of one red blood cell in some places. You know, that's how big the capillary is like single file kind of lines are going through this. Anyway, the epithelial layer is so thin that the oxygen can diffuse from the air through the epithelial layer and into the capillary. The iron in the unoxygenated blood grabs hold of the oxygen. Then it moves out of the area, coming back into itself, back into larger capillaries, and moving up and through the body. And so then it moves oxygen into the rest of the body. Flows around, gets rid of the oxygen, comes back down, picks up more oxygen, and it goes out. The waste product, all of the carbon dioxide, is blown out in the exhalation process, and then there, again, that's where we can hijack it and create sound. All right, so let's see. Oh, yeah, one last thing I wanted to mention about the alveoli is the bubble-like structure that they end up having here is to maximize surface area. So the surface area is good because you can fit more blood around many alveoli than if this was just one structure, right? The more surface area you have, the more blood can get on there, the more efficiently you can oxygenate the blood. What happens as a smoker, emphysema, when you have emphysema if you're a smoker, and this kind of hits home for me because for a few years I smoked. Hopefully they've healed by now. The smoking can actually destroy the little linings between the alveoli. And essentially it takes all of that surface area that you've got and converts it just into one, larger bubble. You have much less surface area on one larger bubble than you do all these dozens of little bubbles. And so you're not as efficient at exchanging deoxygenated blood for oxygenated blood. And because of that, oxygenated blood doesn't get all the way to the ends of your fingers. Your fingers are cold, the ends of your nose are cold, your feet are cold, things like that. That's why chronic smokers tend to have cold fingers and toes. And so that is a problem with smoking. It can also affect your vocal folds, but we'll talk about that when we get to phonation. All right, that's the end of airways and lungs. And that is the end of my lectures for this week. There's a couple recommended videos and so, the readings that you need to do, and then one quiz. And then that's your week. Also, all that stuff that I forgot that I should have posted in the very first week. Sorry about that. But I'd like to get to know you guys since we are spending an entire half semester together. So please do that. You'll get some points for just answering what your interests are and your favorite flavor of ice cream. All right. That is it for this week.